I've never seen a bill like this, and I've never seen a process to push it through so quickly. You could call it the big, beautiful bulldozer bill.
Mark Carney promised to move fast, but is his plan to get going on major national projects moving too quickly? I'm Catherine Cullen, and this week on The House, we'll take you through the concerns about the Building Canada Act, the Grand Chief of Treaty 8 of Alberta on why he's frustrated, and we'll ask the government House Leader why the need for speed. Plus, is Mark Carney CEO of Canada? A look at how the Prime Minister is operating and whether his 30-day deadline with Donald Trump could bring us any closer to a deal. We've got two veteran Hill watchers. Also, the world's most powerful military alliance is about to meet, and they want everyone, including Canada, to pony up billions more. How much can and should Canada spend? If the U.S. does attack Iran, what are the implications for NATO allies, including this country? But we begin with the plan to build fast, an economic necessity or a collision course with Indigenous rights. The House is now in session.
For too long, when federal agencies have examined a new project, their immediate question has been why. With this bill, we will instead ask ourselves how.
This isn't a way to respect each other. We don't need more colonialism when we have Trump's colonialism at our borders, and ramming something through is not the way to go.
Two very different takes on the same plan from Prime Minister Mark Carney and Assembly of First Nations Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak. They're talking about the Building Canada Act, part of Bill C-5. It would dramatically speed up approvals for projects deemed to be in the national interest. They could range from ports to nuclear facilities or hydro corridors, possibly oil pipelines. The speed would come from approving projects faster by streamlining, putting one minister in charge of a single document that sets the conditions for new projects. But the bill also says the government can exempt the projects from environmental laws and acts of parliament. And the push to speed up projects is going through at a pretty intense speed itself, much faster than typical legislation. It's all a bit too much, too fast for some. Ontario Regional Chief Abraham Benedict.
The government talks about truth and reconciliation, has legislation around UNDRIP, talks about free, prior, informed consent, and the process being used by the federal government to introduce legislation and bring it forward, ratified, within less than 2 months is unacceptable. I can tell you that Canadians ought to be alarmed.
There's absolutely no need to get the bill passed in weeks. It can take the summer. It can ask the House to sit.
Anna Johnston is a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. She was part of a news conference this week with various environmental groups calling for the bill to be overhauled.
Aside from the fact that it is being rushed through Parliament at a breakneck speed, I think one of my top concerns is that it has Cabinet making decisions before it has any information about these major projects other than the details that proponents have elected to give them. So for half a century in Canada, decision-making has operated under the principle that we should look before we leap into project decisions that could affect Canadians and the environment that we rely on. This bill turns that decision-making framework on its head and has Cabinet making decisions before it's done any reviews of the consequences of the project.
That breakneck speed she mentioned, the government's goal is to get this legislation passed before Canada Day. That's in part because C-5 isn't just about building big projects. It's also got a section on dismantling some interprovincial trade barriers, and the Prime Minister pledged that would be dealt with by July 1st. To pull it off, Liberals and Conservatives voted to limit debate. For Toronto Liberal MP Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, that's worrying.
This federal government is proposing to shut down democratic debate, curtail committee scrutiny, and jam the bill through the legislature. It would all actually make Harper blush. Liberals would rightly scream, that we would scream if a federal Conservative government attempted the same.
While all of this was playing out in Ottawa, Ontario's Doug Ford was getting ready to meet with First Nations leaders about his own plans for project development, when on Wednesday, he said this.
There's going to be a point that you can't just keep coming hat in hand all the time to the government. You've got to be able to take care of yourselves. And when you literally have gold mines, nickel mines, every type of critical mineral that the world wants, and you're saying, no, I don't want to touch that. By the way, give me money. Not going to happen. It's simple.
Those remarks were decried as racist. About 24 hours later, Ford sat down with several dozen Ontario chiefs. He left apologetic.
I just want to say I sincerely apologize for my words, not only if it hurt all the chiefs in that room, but all First Nations. And I get passionate because I want prosperity for their communities. I want prosperity for their children and their grandchildren.
Back on Parliament Hill, ministers assured MPs studying the bill that fast-tracking big projects won't come at the cost of treaty rights. Here's Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Rebecca Alty.
First, let me start by being crystal clear. Major projects will only proceed under this Act with meaningful consultation and accommodation with Indigenous rights holders.
On Wednesday, the committee sat well into the night and proposed nearly 24 changes to the bill. Finally, on Friday, just before 6 o'clock, the whole One Canadian Economy bill passed the House of Commons with support from the Conservatives. But the party's deputy leader, Melissa Lantsman, told Power and Politics she still has reservations.
I think C5 is a step in that right direction. But if you take it back for a second, there is a lot of things that stop us from getting projects built. There's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of red tape, and we continue to believe that getting rid of C69, that getting rid of the tanker ban, that getting rid of the industrial carbon tax and the emissions cap is the only successful way.
But even as the bill passed the House of Commons, the Prime Minister announced he was going to do more to address some of the concerns around the legislation, holding summits this summer with Indigenous rights holders.
These projects will build our national economy, and through Indigenous equity and resource management, these projects will be built with Indigenous nations and communities. This is not an aspiration. It is the plan embedded in the bill itself.
But do those summits do enough to ease concerns? Trevor Mercredi is the Grand Chief of Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta. He spoke before a parliamentary committee this week to share his thoughts on the bill. Grand Chief, welcome to the House.
Thank you for having me.
How concerned are you right now? The legislation has passed through the House of Commons with some amendments. The Prime Minister has come out and said there are going to be these summits with Indigenous leaders to talk about the path forward for consultation. At this moment, how concerned are you about Indigenous rights being respected with this new Building Canada Act?
Right now, we're very concerned. The Chiefs of Treaty 8 are very concerned that the bill was passed. We did make statements as witnesses at the standing committee this week on Wednesday, and we put forward some recommendations that we would have liked to see amended into the legislation, primarily to make sure that free, prior, and informed consent were explicitly within the bill, and also the articles within UNDRIP to make sure that they would comply with our rights and our constitutional rights that are enshrined within the Constitution. So it was an interesting to be participating at that level and speaking to the MPs directly on the bill. I would say that it was a very important issue that we're trying to bring forward. The reason that I'm saying it in this way is because the strategy that we had to use when we were dealing with this issue is to come and put some place markers, to make sure that we've discussed our issues at the hearing and put some place markers down. So if it ever comes up, we could say, look, we spoke about this. We talked about our issues.
Okay, let's break this down because there's so much going on here. Starting with the government's stated plan, which is to get these big nation-building projects moving faster. When you have conversations with people in your community, in your province, what is it that you see in terms of opportunity here? Because certainly that's part of this. What is it that you see in terms of opportunity for First Nations to get involved in projects?
Well, we do see that this is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to be involved in major projects, and there was certain portions of the bill that were supported by our chiefs, and the initiatives that would be involved. The issues that we have is that with most projects in Canada, or I can say all projects in Canada, the nations receive no benefit from any of these major projects unless they have equity stake. And there's issues that we have with equity stake. Even, it's an initiative that we involve ourselves in, and it's something that we're very interested in, but it's not the end all be all. There has to be resource revenue sharing. And the reason I say that is because even with the equity model, some of our nations are left behind in severe poverty. And we need to make sure that all of our nations, all of our communities within Canada are treated the same, whether they're Indigenous or not. Our communities are not supported by resource revenues. And, every single community within Canada, the cities, the smaller communities, are all supported by the natural resources that come from our territories. Yet we don't receive that same benefit.
Mm-hmm. And you hear the government talking about the idea that it is going to really partner with Indigenous peoples and with First Nations specifically on these projects. The Prime Minister said today, these projects will be built with Indigenous nations and communities. This is not an aspiration. It is the plan embedded in the bill itself. But even as he says that, we hear from some Indigenous leaders, particularly First Nation leaders, that, as you said, there are worries about consent. So how do we square the fact that the government keeps saying the very heart of the bill is working with Indigenous peoples, and yet these worries persist?
Well, I would say that, there's a severe lack of trust between the nations and the federal government and the provinces. That's why we always push and we have to strategize in certain ways legally to make sure that our rights are protected. And what has happened when this bill was announced and we were given a week to respond, it really left our chiefs very uneasy. And I would say that they're very apprehensive in moving one way or another with any industry, because we don't know what's coming. The bill is not complete. There's lots of missing parts to it. They reference a lot of things that have yet to be built or structured into the bill. So it leaves a lot of openness that can really harm not only our people, but Canada. And the non-Indigenous population has to be concerned that this legislation effectively bypasses a lot of the protections that were in place from previous legislations. It does away with all that. So, that's a concern. But when we talk about the economic side of things, and when they talk about equity stake and these projects and they want to have a real true partnership, the nations are open to having a respectful relationship. That's what we're hoping for. That's what we're pushing for. We can't keep going in the same direction of stalling or basically having projects not move forward because they're being legally challenged, because the governments will not respect our rights that have been confirmed many, many times in the Supreme Court. Why do they keep doing this? Why not work with us? Give us a fair deal, respect our people, respect our health, and allow us to be partners. That's all we're asking.
So when the Prime Minister announces these summits, he says he's going to sit around the table with rights holders and consult. How far does that go towards reassuring you?
Well, as we know, talk is cheap. We've been talked to a lot. We talk to ministers, we talk to prime ministers, we talk to premiers, we talk to a lot of different people. But even though we've been talking for decades, there has been no movement to provide our people with a better life. When I say that, it's very hurtful to see that, so many municipalities, so many people are benefiting from the resources of Canada that are in Canada in our territories. We are the rightful owners of those resources. Otherwise, we would not be at the table. Otherwise, you would not be having this discussion with me. So, all really people have to do is really take a look at the problem and look at it in a way that allows themselves to be open and understanding and try to understand our problems so they can be partners with us. We are tired of being public enemy number one when it comes to resources, when it comes to industry. And that's what we're portrayed as, when all we're trying to do is what's right for our people, keep them healthy, keep them prosperous, and build a future for our children, just like every other Canadian that benefits from these resources.
I hear your frustration. And I suppose in closing, I would ask you what you feel the best chance is for hope of avoiding a situation where, once again, a project or just the government, the legislation writ large, winds up before the court, or before we find ourselves again in a situation of protest. I know at least one chief has raised the prospect of Idle No More 2.0. So what is the best path for hope out of that from this moment?
I would say this is bigger than Idle No More 2.0. I wouldn't use that type of terminology because this is bigger. Has the capacity to make it much more difficult than the issues that we were facing when Idle No More was happening. And the difference between now and then is, as you can see, our people are not in the streets yet, but all of our nations have legal counsel backing them. Treaty 8 has legal counsel backing them. The nations are ready. The nations are ready to move whichever way they have to move to protect themselves and to become partners. We're really trying to work here with the government, with industry, but we need both government and industry to get together with us and come up with a plan that we can all be proud of, that we can all move forward. When we talk about one Canadian economy, that has to mean that us as Indigenous people are a part of that. And this bill effectively removes that. So that's why we have concern. Talk is cheap.
Talk can be cheap, but I am very grateful for this conversation with you. Thank you, Grand Chief.
Thank you.
Trevor Mercredi is the Grand Chief of Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta. So what does the government have to say about why it's including more Indigenous consultation now? Late Friday, I sat down with Government House Leader Stephen McKinnon in his office on Parliament Hill. Minister, thank you for making the time.
It's great to be here.
The Prime Minister just came out and announced more consultations with Indigenous people. This comes, as you would know, after a week of intense criticism over the lack of consultation. Some chiefs suggesting there's been, frankly, a lack of respect for Indigenous rights in this country. Are these additional consultations coming in the coming weeks and months an acknowledgement that there is something that needs to be fixed, that you got something wrong?
We've just begun to speak about these major projects and the possibilities for all Canadians, including and maybe even specifically Indigenous communities. We know that there are Indigenous communities right across Canada who wish to participate in these projects, who wish to have equity participation, but at minimum community benefits, employment, and positive ramifications for people they represent, or for education, health, and what have you. So there are a lot of possibilities and a lot of things that I know that Mr. Carney and other ministers will want to dig into with rights holders, with people in communities right across the country. I see nothing but promise, and I think that will bear out over time. It is a process. It is always a process. But the good news is that we've started now with this enabling legislation, being able to talk about tangible things.
I understand why you want to focus on the positive, but you say you see nothing but promise. There are chiefs out there, certainly the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who says that the process thus far has not been respectful in terms of consulting them. Is that a problem that you are trying to rectify?
It's important to note that this is enabling legislation, and the real debates will occur as we move towards discussing specific projects. There will be projects right across the country. They will feature to varying degrees depending on geographies and other things. The possibility of Indigenous participation, that is important. And I know that leaders from all walks of life, including in the Indigenous community, will want to have their concerns addressed. But at the end of the day, this is a government that was elected on getting things done, on getting the economy moving, on responding to Donald Trump. And this is the centerpiece of our work on that.
But why does it have to happen so quickly? In many quarters, you have heard people say, another week even, not wait until the fall, but just a bit more time to consider such a pivotal piece of legislation.
Well, it's rare that another week for someone who has misgivings will result in addressing those.
I think it's rather that they want to be heard.
Well, I do understand that, and I think the essential part of what we are saying is that we will be fanning out. The Prime Minister is announcing some major meetings that will include a vast array of Indigenous nations, of rights holders and others, economic actors in the Indigenous community, and there are many, and they will be meeting with the Prime Minister and other ministers to dig into this work. This is incredibly promising work for Indigenous leaders, although we understand that there will always be a need to continue to communicate and dialogue, and that is work that we've committed to undertake.
A member of your own caucus, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, said the Liberals would, quote, scream if a federal Conservative government attempted the same thing, to do this quickly. What do you say to him?
Well, I don't agree. And moreover, I specifically don't agree because we just spent an entire election campaign talking about this very thing on every single day. And I think what it's important, Catherine, for your listeners to appreciate is that we are at a critical economic time. We have a major trade war underway. We have 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. These are crippling tariffs to our steel industry, to people in Hamilton, to people in Sault Ste. Marie, and in small businesses right across the country, Saskatchewan, Quebec, and other places. This is a critical industry to Canada, as is aluminum. That is one example. Tariffs have had an overall slowing effect on consumers, on business investment, and this is our response so that we can do things for ourselves that others cannot take away from us. We're going to be using Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, Canadian lumber in many of these major projects. That is also a key part of it. If you ask unions, if you ask the building trades, if you ask industrial unions, they will tell you how much they appreciate the opportunities afforded to them by this bill.
I take your point that much has been said about the big picture here, but the Prime Minister said when it comes to Indigenous participation, this is not an aspiration, it is embedded in the bill itself. And there are Indigenous leaders out there who look at this same legislation and are not clear that this respect of their rights that your government keeps saying is so integral to the bill is indeed in there. So that's pretty different from a conversation that you're having in the election. And I come back to you, what would you say to those people about the need to do this so quickly?
Well, Indigenous rights are in Section 35 of the Constitution. They are mentioned several times in this legislation. And you can see where the Prime Minister, upon passage of the bill, walked out with the prominent Indigenous members of our government, 3 of whom are ministers, to talk specifically about the process, the road we want to now walk together with Indigenous peoples.
Is that road enough to prevent court challenges?
I think that what we're looking at it from the other end of the telescope, Catherine. We're looking at it from the possibility of creating opportunities for young people in this country, many who live in remote communities, many who live lives where economic hope has not always been a prominent feature. And now there will be an opportunity for their representatives and they themselves to participate by working on or even participating financially in the benefits of some major projects in Canada.
Not if those projects are tied up in court.
This gives us, I think this gives people a lot of great hope. And this bill goes a long way, not to sacrifice our environmental principles, not to sacrifice Indigenous rights, but to move more quickly.
You only have a few days to get this passed in the Senate. I know there is a motion to make this happen quickly, but you do not control what happens in the Senate. How can you be so confident that this will be done by Canada Day?
Well, we don't control what happens in the Senate. They are an independent body, but I'm very confident that they will give it. I know they've had a pre-study, they've had hearings in committee of the whole, so the entire Senate has been exposed to a lot of the evidence, and I'm confident they'll take it up quite efficiently.
Stephen McKinnon, thank you for your time.
Great pleasure.
Government House Leader Stephen McKinnon. Next up on the House podcast, what happens when the Prime Minister runs the country like he's a CEO? our veteran political journalists weigh in. Stay with us. I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Make sure to give us a follow so you never miss an episode, and tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca. Observers have said Mark Carney wants to move fast and break things, that he's running the country like a corporation. How is that working for Canadians? And will Carney's 30-day deadline for a new deal with the Americans pan out? Let's talk about it. Tonda McCharles is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Joël Denis Bellavance is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse. Tonda, JD, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
JD, Mark Carney promised speed, record speed. Is he moving too fast, though?
Well, to some people, yes. But I think you could say that this prime minister is a prime minister in a hurry. In French, I would say anti-tatouinage. So no time to waste for this government. And that's basically what we see. He wants to see, projects moving at a speed which we haven't imagined. That was his expression during the election campaign. And that's actually what we see. It's a profound rupture with the precedent government, I would say, the previous government led by Justin Trudeau. And so for those who were anticipating a new government with a new agenda, with a new way of doing things, we get a lot for our money.
Tonda, you wrote this week about Mark Carney's corporate leadership style. And we've heard this idea that he's running the country as if he were a CEO. What does that mean?
Well, if you think about CEOs, they're often supported by boards of directors, but the buck stops at that desk, and they are the ones that make the decisions. And in this case, it is actually turning out to be the leadership style of Mark Carney and also the pace at which, that JD just spoke about, at which he's moving. And his parliamentary colleagues, the other leaders in the House, some of them, Blanchette, of the Bloc Québécois, most notably, has said that doesn't work in Parliament. You've got to work with the other parties. And even in his caucus and in his cabinet, they've experienced he's the top dog. And they've experienced that in ways that conversations are had, perhaps. He's been pretty quick. He doesn't raise his voice, I'm told, but he's been pretty quick to snap back at people who aren't ready up on their files, don't have data to present to make their arguments. He's told senior deputy ministers, you don't know your file, don't come back when you know your file. And he's told other senior staff who've handed him documents that they themselves hadn't fully read. What's in it? I don't know. You should have read it.
Yeah.
And so there's a bit of he's the top dog and he's driving action and he's forcing everybody to up their game in a way. But that only works perhaps in a setting where you are making decisions around your office. But when it comes to Indigenous consultation, when it comes to involving those who have environmental concerns they need and want addressed before they'll give you the license to do what you want to do, that's an issue.
Well, in that vein, about working sort of the parliamentary side of it, the politics, JD, it's so striking to think about what things were like in the fall. Virtually no legislation was getting passed. Nothing was moving. And now the idea is perhaps things are moving too quickly. Obviously, a big part of that is the Liberals and the Conservatives being on the same page on some big issues like C5, like big national projects. How long do you think that's going to last? Is this a honeymoon period thing, or is this a greater aligning of values?
Well, I think that the Conservative Party, like everyone else who is an observer of the House of Commons, can see that the Blue Liberals are back in charge. The Blue Liberals being centre-right Liberals. And Mark Carney clearly is a centre-right Liberals. More focused on the economy, less on moral issues than grandstanding, lecturing people. So that pleases the Conservative Party. And the people that Mr. Carney chooses to surround himself with, like Michael Sabia, the new clerk of the Privy Council, I would qualify him also in the category of a blue liberal, mandarin, if I may say. And the other people like François-Philippe Champagne, Mélanie Joly, Dominique Leblanc, those people, I would characterize them also as blue liberals. And they are really in charge right now. Even Anita Anand in Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that, projects different dynamics in the House of Commons, and it leads the Conservative Party to being, tempted to support the government. How long will it last, depending what policies Mr. Carney comes up with in the future?
I suppose part of it, though, too, is the state of the Conservative Party, right? That also puts them in a position where they're more inclined to get along right now because their leader isn't in the House of Commons.
Yeah, that I think probably is also another point that helps Mr. Carney have sort of like a super majority in the House of Commons with the help of the Conservative Party right now.
I mean, I think it's also a reflection of just how much thunder Carney has stolen from the Conservatives on policy. He is doing what they promised to do, move at speeds that require quick decision-making and circumventing, or at least the ability to circumvent some of the onerous rules and red tape. So it's a hard thing for them to disagree with, isn't it?
Tonda, I want to turn to something else you covered this week. You were at the G7 in Kananaskis. No big blow-up with Trump. But what do you think was meaningfully accomplished in terms of Canada and Mark Carney?
Well, look, they had an intensive conversation for more than an hour, Carney and Trump. And Carney was able to put forward this 30-day deadline to sort of lock down a commitment to get these talks going. Most of the other countries, you'll recall, when global tariffs were somewhat paused, will see tough decisions coming between now and July 9th. But Carney's extended Canada's conversation and focused the discussion with a deadline that's a bit longer than that, and also kind of, I think, set out some parameters for those conversations. More broadly speaking, what was accomplished at the G7, Donald Trump didn't blow it up. And every single delegation, no matter how much that might seem trivial, every single delegation there I talked to, and I talked to them all, they noted that was a significant achievement in the sense that the G7, they felt, was able to put forward a unified front, a common front. But it didn't really. It didn't either on Iran, Israel, and it didn't either on Ukraine. There are big fissures there. And there are also big fissures globally between the G7 countries and Donald Trump on tariffs and the impact on the global economy.
So in that vein, is there more Mark Carney could have done, or is it unrealistic to put that on any world leader?
Look, I think it's all a work in progress. And I mean, they all view him as somewhat of a champion of the broader interests of the other G7 countries.
JD, this 30-day deadline that Tonda referenced earlier for a deal with the Americans, how big a gamble is the Prime Minister taking by setting a deadline?
I think he wants to force the Americans to make a decision and negotiate in good faith, because we've seen, that's what we've heard, that, Canada was sending proposals to Washington, but they were receiving it, but no response. So the Canadian government was tired of, not getting any response, and that's why Mr. Carney wanted to put a deadline. Now, the fact that he announced the kind of measures he intends to put on July 21st, if the negotiation does not lead to a successful elimination of the tariffs, leads me to believe that I think Plan B is already in the works, meaning that they expect there will be no deal with the United States. That's my expectation as well. I'm very skeptical that Mr. Trump would abandon his cherished idea of no tariffs on Canada, even though we're the closest partners. So I think that it's a way to prepare Canadians that it will be a prolonged commercial war with the United States.
In fact, all along through this, I was always struck by the disconnect between the Canadian expectation and the Trump administration's assertions that it's all about tariffs. When I asked Trump at the G7 on Monday, what's holding this up? Nothing, he said. I'm a tariff person. It's going to be, it's tariffs. And on the Canadian side, when Mr. Carney laid out his plan for after July 21st, his Plan B, as JD called it, that's the first time since the election campaign and since his re-election that we've heard Mark Carney publicly say it may not be in the cards that we come up with a deal that actually sees all tariffs lifted. I don't think he has publicly sort of started to till the ground for that in Canadians' minds.
And to me, if that negotiations fail, what does that leave us with the future of free trade with the United States and Mexico, the future of COSMA, which, we expect to renew next year, start negotiating. That leads me to believe that the era of free trade that we have known with the United States and Mexico since the 1990s are over.
It's such a remarkable time. And then we have another international meeting coming up. Mark Carney headed an EU summit and the NATO summit. And I just wonder, JD, what will you be watching for? Because when we talk about Mark Carney laying the ground, he has laid the ground for this NATO meeting, saying Canada is going to meet 2% this fiscal year and go beyond that. What will you be watching
I
to
will
see?
be watching whether Mr. Carney will push back against the idea of having a target of 5%. Spain is already pushing back. So that's something, we can look at and say, can we afford that kind of money, spending money in the military as Canadians, given the state of our nation's finance? The answer is no. And I think Mr. Carney realized that. Maybe we could go to 3.5, but 5%, I don't think we can expect that. That will raise the future of NATO as an alliance. Can Canada remain in that alliance if we can't afford to stay and meet the 5% target?
Doesn't it depend on the timeline, though? And I think that if Canada gets a long enough runway, at least in name and for the sake of getting along, Mr. Carney might be in a position to say, sure, we think that everybody should spend more on defense, so should we, and we need a long runway to do it. The timing is everything, and I'm hearing talk among delegations that 2032 is one of the deadlines they're looking at. Will Canada support that, or do they need a longer runway, 2035, whatever? Nobody's expecting, I think, any of these countries to instantly up their spending from now Canada's 2% to 5% this year. So I think that's what I'm watching for. What's the timeline for that?
Okay, we are all trying to live with the speed at which Mark Carney is running this country right now. Appreciate you both taking the time to put this all in context for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
The Toronto Star's Tonda McCharles and J.D. Bellevance of La Presse. Spend more money. That is the ask of NATO members ahead of next week's summit. President Donald Trump wants alliance members to agree to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. That's what NATO Secretary General is looking for as well. But Canada's pledge to that previous target of 2% this fiscal year, the Prime Minister only announced that last week. So, how much more can Mark Carney realistically promise? What are those discussions going to be like next week? We have two former NATO insiders to give us their perspective. On the diplomatic side, Wendy Gilmore is the former Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO. On the military side, Bob Davidson is a retired Vice Admiral and was the Canadian military representative to NATO from 2012 to 2016. Welcome to the House to you both.
Thank you very much.
Wendy, I'm going to start with you. We know Spain is already getting a little bit squishy about this target, asking if perhaps there can be an exception made. Is there some sort of workaround? How difficult is it going to be to get countries to all agree to hit that 5% target?
Obviously very difficult. Every country in NATO right now is struggling not only with the need to reinvest in defense, but also to shore up their economies in the face of a really uncertain global economic environment. I think the critical thing is ensuring that all nations understand, and are able to communicate to their public why it is important to put more money into the defense sector and to put more money into defense capabilities, but also understanding that the manner in which NATO seems to be approaching this new target is also about not just core defense capabilities, but the larger infrastructure that supports them, which also has immediate benefit to the populations in the NATO countries.
I want to ask, Wendy, you're making the case for it, but do you think 5% is the right number?
There is no right number. It's a hand, like the 2% in 2014. 5% is a nice round number. It's really 3% plus 1.5 to 2%, as it seems to be breaking down at the moment. And it's for each country in NATO to be able to understand what they need to do themselves to support not only the NATO commitments, but most importantly, to shore up their own security. People often forget that the NATO treaty is based first and foremost that nations are investing in their own security so that they don't become a problem for collective defense, but then secondly, they have the necessary capabilities to go to the broader defense of the NATO alliance.
Bob, Wendy talked about the last time that a target was formally agreed to. You were around for that. Give us a sense of what that was like, trying to get everyone in the alliance on the same page about 2% and reaching 2%.
Well, the truth is that NATO's pretty darn good at creating language that has loopholes that you can drive a truck through.
A tank, perhaps.
A tank, perhaps, yes. And so, language tends to be written in a way that says that nations will strive, in the initial stages, nations will strive towards reaching something. And so they make it relatively easy for nations to sign on to a commitment that leaves within it room for them to perhaps adjust the timeline at which they're going to meet it, or perhaps even not intend to meet it and fall short, but give other reasons for it.
So they can all stand on the same page and say, we are united, we are moving forward.
Yeah, it's the all for one for all kind of concept. So everybody wants to join consensus when the communique comes out. You want to all be on board with it. But there's plenty of room to maneuver. Now, when Canada did it and signed on, I don't think we really had the intention to come close to 2% anytime soon. And of course, here we are a decade later, more than a decade later, and we're finally talking about getting to the 2%. So we certainly haven't done it quickly or on time or early, as the Prime Minister's statement recently said that it was early. It's not early, but at least we did make the commitment in the end.
Do you think it's different this time? I mean, there is a sense of the world in 2014, time of the Wales Declaration, versus now feels like a very different place. Do you think that nations will be more inclined to reach a new target?
I personally don't think that the world is that different. I think we saw the writing on the wall back in 2012 when I was at NATO and we were watching, and indeed when Russia invaded Crimea. The world hasn't dramatically changed. It's our understanding of it that has matured. And now I think Canadians are starting to understand just how unstable the world is. And so we're seeing a shift in public opinion polls that support more defense spending. That's a very good thing. But, I don't think that the urgency is greater, although, of course, we are getting closer and closer to potential conflict, in my view.
Which to me, I mean, I find that hard to disentangle that with the sense of urgency. But I also want to talk about the actual doing, Wendy. How hard is it going to be for countries to actually meet that target, to effectively spend the money on their militaries to get there?
Obviously, spending money has to be difficult because we're using public funds and we have a real responsibility to our public to do it well. But we also have a responsibility to our public to spend the money to assure them of their own security. I mean, one of the things that has significantly changed for Canada and for the Canadian public is our understanding that we are no longer comfortable in our contributing well, but still as solely a contributor to security arranged by others, that we actually have to take responsibility for our own defense and our own security and our own infrastructure. And that's why what I'm sure the government has, and former colleagues in our Defense Department and elsewhere around government have been spending a lot of time over the last few months since the start of the new government, but also since, frankly, the inauguration of President Trump and some of his statements, understanding, all right, we need to do this, we need to do it quickly. What are the projects that are shovel-ready? What are the investments that we can make that will show immediate benefit right away? And frankly, what's going to take a longer term? I mean, it's very different if you're putting shovels in the ground to repair Canadian defense infrastructure, which has been left dilapidated for far too long, and improving the salaries and the conditions under which our men and women of the Canadian Forces work. And then, all right, we have to give considered thought to our next generation military capabilities like submarines or other major platforms, which obviously take longer. But it's going to be hard. And it's also hard because, of course, it's economics, it's supply and demand. And there is a huge demand for defense capabilities right now. There's a huge demand for ammunition, for example, as we've seen in Ukraine and elsewhere. And so everybody's trying to get the same things at the same time.
In that regard, Bob, I mean, everybody is trying to get the same things. I mean, they're trying to beef up NATO members. We see, obviously, Russia's now full-scale war in Ukraine. NATO Secretary General just noted recently, China is increasingly building up its armed forces. And I wonder, when we think about this moment, to what extent is there something of is it an arms race right now? I mean, what would you call what is happening?
Well, I put it more as a realization than an arms race. I mean, we're watching what's taking place. You mentioned Ukraine, the expenditure of munitions, the expenditure of UAVs, drones, those kinds of capabilities. It's very high. We're starting to realize just how much of a stockpile we would need if we were going to be in conflict with anybody in the nature of modern warfare. So I think there's that level of realization that's driving people. As to whether it's really an arms race, I'm a proponent of the belief that you assure peace by preparing for war. And we've heard this many times from others, but it is in readiness that we display to potential aggressors our ability to respond. And so you could call it an arms race. I would call it a strive for peace as well.
Wendy, when we talk about Canada's plan, before the Prime Minister goes to the NATO summit, he's taking part in this Canada-EU summit. We expect him to sign onto a security and defence partnership with the EU. What will that mean for Canada?
I think it's a great thing. What it'll mean is that Canada will be able to participate with the EU and EU nations in defence planning, defence development of new technologies. And if we're not in an arms race, we are certainly in a technology race. What it means ultimately is that the EU has decided to collectively bring funds to the table, the necessary environment to the table to do their defence investments in a more efficient and effective way. And this security and defence partnership will allow countries like Canada, the other ones that have signed on, to participate in EU programs that will create economies of scale. It will leverage each other's technological developments. It will mean that Canadian companies and Canadian technologies can be integrated into European technologies, which ultimately is to everyone's benefit. It's really important for us to be able not only to work with Europeans for our own economic benefit and our own defence capability, but also from a NATO sense to remain interoperable, to ensure that our forces are able to work with one another on the battlefield in a way that has common standards and common effects.
Another piece of all of this is Ukraine. And in past meetings, Ukraine has been at the table. And this time they are only, Volodymyr Zelensky is only getting invited to a dinner. How much attention do you foresee Ukraine and Ukraine's plight getting at this NATO meeting?
I think there'll still be quite a lot of attention paid to the Ukraine. I mean, there's still a lot of activity going on in relation to that. There are more commitments coming from nations. We've just recently made another commitment to them. I'm quite sure that most of the allies will be talking about it. Whether the U.S. president does is a different matter, and whether there's an ability to come to some kind of consensus for a final communique, that I can't be sure of, but undoubtedly it will focus enormously in the conversation.
But how much is Donald Trump's attention critical in that conversation?
Well, you can't have a communique on this subject without consensus. That's the way the alliance works. It's always about consensus. So they're going to have to find language that everybody can agree to, or it won't appear. And if it doesn't appear, that would be a concern.
Wendy, also looming over the meeting is the war between Israel and Iran and the potential for greater U.S. involvement in the region. How will what's happening there shape what comes out of the meeting?
Whenever you get the leaders together, they are going to be looking at the overall global circumstance. Of course, their focus for this meeting is NATO and reshoring NATO capabilities. But there's also a sense that global instability is going to have an immediate and very critical impact on the security of the Euro-Atlantic area. I mean, I was at the North Atlantic Council at Defense Ministers right after the tragic attack on Israel of October 7th. And the Israeli defense minister came to the meeting and presented sort of his case. And obviously the situation has evolved tremendously since then, not the least of which is this latest attack on Iran. But the leaders, I'm sure, will be having bilaterals in which it will figure very prominently. They will be looking to see collectively what they can do. I mean, ideally, NATO, the communique would normally forecast a call on the parties to exercise restraint, to disengage, to return to a diplomatic process. Whether or not that will be possible, as Bob said, is unknown at this point. But certainly it will loom large. The fact that there is a conventional war in Eastern Europe that is threatening NATO territory, that there is now an ongoing air campaign in the Middle East, not to mention the competition with China and the ongoing conflicts elsewhere in the world, it is a particularly critical time for leaders to be able to come together and ideally determine some collective action on how to address it.
Bob, in closing, the prospect of the U.S. striking Iran, what could that mean for NATO members?
Well, obviously there's a potential risk associated with a response from Iran, be it military or indeed be it economic in the form of embargo, for example, in the Strait of Hormuz, which could drive oil prices, skyrocket them. So there are a lot of things that Iran could do that would have both economic and military impacts on allies, and there are U.S. troops in the area. There are Canadians and others not far from Iran in various missions. So if they're put at risk, then obviously it's an important factor. So I think we have to watch that very closely and see how the response plays out. But it almost becomes impossible for an attack by the United States to not have enormous impact on NATO.
Okay, as you say, a critical time, a time of great intensity. Really appreciate both of your perspectives on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Wendy Gilmore is the former Assistant Secretary General for Defence Investment at NATO, and Bob Davidson is a retired Vice Admiral and was the Canadian military representative at NATO. Okay, that is it for us this week. Our crew on the House is Kristen Everson, Victoria Valito, and Benjamin Lopez-Steven. And our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical help this week from Miguel Plant. I am Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.